Alright, hello, and this is going to be a discussion video about Plato's The Republic. Uh, we kind of hopping around a little bit on the channel, but I figured we could go back to um, Plato since I hadn't done that yet, at least in videos. Um, and talk a bit about this text since there's so much that you can take away from it and the implications for it. You find medieval theology, even political concepts like communism or fascism. This is why he's so regarded as he's almost simultaneously everyone's guy and no one's guy at the same time. I think this has to do with the system that he gives through the forms, and it's kind of like far more open-ended than Aristotle, who comes later, that we covered, and how he definitely has more characteristics and well, he's looking at particulars and metaphysics and questions like that, whereas Plato is far more suggestive, I think would be fair to say. But one of the themes I wanted to talk about, and really from the start of the text and the dialogue that Socrates is having, is you can't ever persuade someone in bad faith. You can't convince someone that doesn't want to be convinced. Even as you question them and they agree with you over and over again, that doesn't mean that they're going to be persuaded in the end. And that might not be a rational thing necessarily. And I think this is important to consider as one of the arguments that is happening in book one is helping your friends but hurting your enemies, and might, and you kind of see this element of friend and foe even here in this dialogue, where justice and doing good is helping your friends and really rejecting your enemies. And so not being charitable to Socrates is a moral good, to at least in the dialogue presented to us. And I think once we consider, kind of these narratives that are going on in these discussions on social media about, isn't it ironic such and such is doing this hypocritical thing, or this doesn't line up to their principles, these kind of gotchas. But, it really doesn't matter if it's about the distinction of friend and enemy. You'd be willing to put up a lot more shit among your allies than you will your enemies. And I think that's pretty self-evident in these kind of spheres, these inoculated sort of internet ecologies, if you will, and how they will treat each other, and the concepts of not punching right and not punching left, even to a kind of lesser extent. But I think it's understanding in addition to a lack of persuasion, perhaps, is desire, and how it kind of moves away from the practicality that this text has to offer. And I'm kind of meaning, that I think when people look at this text, oftentimes one of the things I think people would suggest that they get from reading it is how much they enjoy the practicality of having this republic, and censorship's on the table, and it's ruled by philosopher kings, and there's this kind of direct desire towards the health of your society. And it's not in this sort of roundabout way that I think dominates. That's even later on in this text, the idea of the noble lie, and and lying in a democracy, even, to this kind of obfuscation away from our desires, this kind of, I think critiques of this text called it, totalitarian even. But that's just a modern framing of these kind of things, because I think you have to understand, or at least this is one of the main things I want to maybe drive home for anyone watching this video, is the idea that politics and ethics and the deduction that the Greeks do, they do this with the sciences, Aristotle, and kind of the essence of essence, metaphysics, being able to, by asserting something else is true, then this also must be true. And out of that, I think taking that in is how you understand why there is such a practicality to ethics and politics. And they aren't these divorced entities away from each other. It's cohesive. It's alive, and it's harmonious. And I think that's something that one would take away from reading this, and seeing how he talks about censorship and the unification of the cosmos, right? This is the forms. This is saying that there's a rational experience going on, even among the cosmos. And if that's the case, then there has to be an objective way of doing statehood. And I think that's really the core idea here is, as I've talked about before, the micro and the macrocosm of, being able to look around at our own people, even though we have technology and this, the critiques we've gone over before. I don't want to go and do this a million times over, but that kind of obfuscation sort of gets away from our identity and actually looking at each other as people of this nation state, not just these vessels to give rights and take from in this socially current way, but actually seeing each other as citizens and a model of what the ideal American is. And I think in addition to that, I wanted to also talk about the idea that right now we don't have any universals, these kind of universal virtuous goods to go by, but that in and of itself is a universal, in that we are looking at it from this kind of individualistic denial of the forms and denial of virtue, and actually even agreeing upon what is virtuous. And it's kind of interesting. There was a commentary a while back, I can't think of even who said it, but nobody really sits around on the internet dialogue now and talks about the Constitution and stuff like that. Like, this is something that we would do maybe in like 2012, even 5 years ago, even predating Trump, right? You would have your interpretation of the Constitution, and I suppose to some extent there is that happening in normie boomer book or some stuff like that. But for the most part, at least in the scene, if you will, sitting around and talking about the Constitution, that's almost kind of funny now, because it is ultimately just a piece of paper if it doesn't really reflect on your own citizenry or even share the values anymore. We constantly see this denigration of America is not good enough, or the nightmare of what we have become, that I think resonates across the political spectrum. And another key idea I maybe wanted to touch up on is the idea of having power for the sake of power that Socrates talks about. And if you're just helping your friends for the sake of helping your friends, and having this might is right attitude. We see this, obviously. It's kind of a primal, even kind of, there's sort of just this energy about might and right that I think resonates on the right for sure. And this can't be really what the ultimate preference would be for, ideally pushing forward and enacting real change or salvation, I suppose. Because if it's just about might is right, you don't really have any values. There's nothing. There's no good to it. It's just out of this kind of almost libertarian-like outlook, I would say, where one of the arguments is that we only try to do good and have justice because we don't want harm onto ourselves. It's not because we're actually doing it for the good of it. And of course, Socrates points out the polis and living in a just society, in a happier society, if you're able to kind of see the gnomes, if you will, or of us kind of connecting together. If it's more harmonious, then it's more just. I suppose if we wanted to take from Aristotle to an extent that we did in past videos, you have these different interpretations of justice in your city-state, and trying to mitigate that or having it best represented by the philosopher king, to Plato, would be the ideal, I think. So justice and the city is kind of an analogy to the soul, and the soul being rational. I think that also could be fun to maybe point out how he sees the collaboration of the Republic, and contrast to today, and seeing how our authority uses our resentments as a social engine to actually kind of get things done in a way, wielding state power against your enemies and trying to push forward your ideological agendas, whether it's this brief time the right gets to maybe ban critical race theory. I'm not necessarily saying that that's wrong. I'm more saying that it comes to serve that when the left gets power in their own districts, they will wield it against us. They've had no problem doing that, and we could say that they're better than us at that, or even vice versa if you want to play devil's advocate, I suppose. But I don't think that's really the case on my channel. But I think comparing that to today's elite class that uses our resentments to even further solidify their own power, and this is talked about a bit within the text itself as well. The elite class sort of subjugating each other and co-opting each other to further solidify themselves. This has been talked about for thousands of years. I think kind of maybe taking this in tandem with the critique of liberalism with in the lack of universal. There is no universals, and even seeking them could be used against you. And it is also kind of an aside maybe to see when he talks about guardians, and this could be kind of interesting to maybe look at it from the perspective of a subculture. He takes it to an extreme here where he suggests that the guardians could share each other's genetics through interbreeding and sharing each other's wives, and actually not really having a coherent family per se, It's just this sort of class that we use to fight our battles, and they have their place, and we try to make the most of it, this sort of collaboration, as I've talked about. But you can also see this kind of element that Plato offers about no class at all. And this is, of course, a Marxist or a communist ideal of going to the utopia beyond class, and the dialectics around that. So I thought that was kind of interesting to maybe point that out, that Plato does have this sort of element here of kind of communal ownership in a way. And, to some extent, this is kind of salvageable, I think, to understand that. I think Aristotle has it more right when he talks about possession being important to kind of balance out human rationale, to kind of care about his local province, if you will, because he has to have this vested interest, so he has these possessions, but it's also in this kind of tandem of not letting markets pervert your city-state. But I think to some extent this is kind of salvageable, though, because it has this different way of looking at human beings, in that you actually aren't these individuals. You are kind of in a sense a possession of the greater community of your ancestors, and you aren't just this kind of individual, but this succession of these past people and their visions and fears, if you want to look at it kind of novels and arts, and how these sort of fears that actually Socrates in a way talks about censoring. You don't want your guardian class to read poetry, is what he's suggesting. And this is kind of going back towards what we were talking about with understanding different there's different ways of education, and there's different ways of trying to achieve excellence and go about your calling, or answering towards the Dasein. Another observation I made is he seems to be pretty woke on technics. When he talks about censorship, he talks about the kind of gradual change over time. I think, as we've talked about on this channel before, technology, and in particular the internet at large, and how I think it's moving far faster than most people would ideally contend with, I think. And this is a question I've kind of asked, friends and family: do you think technology is out of control, or there's too much shit, and a kind of hyper modern, vulgar way of saying things? And most people would say, yeah, absolutely. There is too much shit. There's too much speed at which technology seems to be going faster than we can even comprehend it and its implications. And I think Plato, in a way, points this out here, and when he talks about censorship and this kind of gradual change within his city. I think this also it kind of tie into another idea that I had when I was looking over this text before making this video, and that's the idea that evil is this lack of wisdom, and this is kind of an old term these days, but the idea of being red-pilled, having this new set of wisdom bestowed upon you, or cracking the code, breaking the mold of the greater social structure. But what do you do with that wisdom ultimately? You can just, sure, you can have information or intel or maybe a few good ideas about what is good, or some unconventional wisdom towards something, but it doesn't really matter unless it's actually aimed towards the good, or trying to neutralize the amount of evil in that kind of sense, and sort of lack of wisdom. And this ties into, of course, the rule of philosopher kings, or in this case, as I kind of titled this video, the political king, because they're, to me, of course, one and the same, and it's invoked the practicality of, I think, one of the advantages that we have in this sort of sphere is our inquiry on trying to live a better life, of having a more wholesome and trying to attribute just wisdom beyond just power for the sake of power, as we talked about in book 1 of the Republic here, but actually seeking wisdom for the good, for the virtuous, and I think most people, just as I have talked about this concept of the province people trying to create a catacombs culture, if you will, within what we got, if you will, and the kind of stratagem for that. And I think most people, when they would sit down and consider, what is the ideal city, what would be your ideal province people, if you will, I don't think it would be that far from Plato's The Republic here. And one of the pragmatic sort of answers Socrates offers when questioned, I think he kind of brushes up on this idea of generational change and in a way, demographics. If he wanted to create this ideal state, this ideal rule of philosopher kings, he suggests you would have to get rid of everyone over the age of 10. They need to be educated properly in a rational structure. This republic structure that focuses and emphasis on the kind of thoroughness and taking in the sort of attributes and strengths through collaboration. And I think this is one of the ideals that us on the right are interested in. He also says, of course, that anything into being has to decay eventually. And this is, kind of maybe interesting to look at from understanding. Perhaps it's not so much important to see, where you are on this kind of, I'm in this sort of past glory day, or I'm in this, I'm on the onset of this next great kingdom, but still seeing that in this kind of present time, there is this kind of necessary taking in today for what it actually is, and perhaps not dwelling so much on where our placement actually is, in Big Civ, or in the collapse, and actually focusing on these kind of universals of what is good at all times, whether it's the kind of vitality of metaphysics and the Spenglerian kind of way of, which is kind of interesting to actually look at Socrates, right? If you look at Spengler and some of the Germans, and I know I'm kind of shooting off on the side here, but it is interesting to maybe think about how, a lot of reactionaries, I think, have this romance towards oral tradition, in that they see writing as kind of a fall of a principle, in a way of writing down as something that's about to be forgotten because it can no longer be spoken about in a proper way. It has to be written down to be remembered. And Plato's philosophy is a lot about remembrance. And I think, Heidegger, he was big on the pre-Socratics, and that would be before Socrates comes to reply to the sophists, and before this canon even begins, right? There's this kind of romantic idea of knowing that when we look to write something down, it's usually because we're on the onset of knowing we're about to lose knowledge. And I think that's an interesting way to maybe take in some of the critiques that German thinkers had to offer in past centuries. But other than that, I wanted to maybe just wrap this up and kind of consider that even as we've alluded to before in Aristotle, even though this text is thousands of years old in a way, it's foretelling. We kind of talked about persuasion, and I think we can vouch for there's political actors and enemies that will never give us the time of day or give us the faith necessary for them to be persuaded. And the kind of distinction of friend and foe that even happens within the Republic itself. And I think a lot of these ancient texts still have very much to offer in wisdom towards the way we're going to be doing things in the future. But yeah, this is just a quick little video I wanted to do since I haven't done one in a while. But thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys for the next one.